Anyway, we thank you for coming. 3 minutes per person, tops. Try to be shorter if you can. Try not to be repetitive if you can. And we're going to be starting in a few minutes. Are you ready?
So, good evening, everyone. My name is Peter Fleming, and I am the chair of Community Board 6, previously the chair of this esteemed committee, now ably led by Mark Shames. So this is kind of like coming home. I was on this committee for 20 years. So it's a long time. So I'm here tonight to tell you a couple of things. First of all, to emphasize to you that this is the beginning of the process. So please don't feel if we don't have a chance to recognize you tonight, or that if we look at your opinion askance or anything else, that this is your last opportunity to express an opinion on this. It's not. So one of the things that I've pledged to do, we had a meeting earlier this week with Councilman Lander, is that if you represent a group that has an opinion on this topic, contact our board office, tell them who you are, and we will ask one of our committees, not necessarily landmarks and land use, because some of the things work better in other committees. A couple of examples where we have a group of developers who own some land along the canal, and they came and made a presentation to us a couple weeks ago that said, if you give us this, we'll give you this. Their this was things like more community space, more affordable housing. Obviously, they want larger buildings, so that's a trade-off that we'll have to consider. We've also heard from, and you're going to have to let me read this one because I haven't yet committed it to memory. We are having a meeting with SEIU, Service Employees International Union, which is 32BJ. And they're concerned, as Community Board 6 is, about the kinds of people that are employed, the availability of jobs to local residents. So we're going to have them come before our Economic Development Committee on March 18th at 6:30. We don't have a meeting space yet, but watch the Community Board website if that's something that interests you. I know there are other groups and organizations, people from public housing, the people that are concerned about the IBZ. We want to hear from all of you. This is our opportunity until this is formally certified sometime in the late fall or early next year to hear what you all have to say, to find out what you think. Then, when we are asked to formally represent or offer an opinion on this, we'll gather all the committee chairs together. We'll ask them about groups that they heard from that had something to say about this. We'll ask them what they thought of what those things were, and we'll try and incorporate some of them. We cannot promise to incorporate all of it. We'd love to be able to do that, but that's not within our, sadly, that's not within our means to do that. I mean, we could ask for all those things, but if we did that, it would dilute our asking for the things that are really important to us. So we will do our very, very best to A, hear from all of you, and B, incorporate as many of your wishes as possible in our response to city planning about this when the ULURP process begins. But again, the most important thing to know is that right now we're in an information gathering process. We're trying to find out what the community thinks, as wide a group of the community as possible, so that we can incorporate, begin to incorporate those things into the response we ultimately make. So I thank you all for coming. We truly appreciate the great turnout. I live only, literally less than a block away, so this is extremely important to me as well, because, periodically I'm wandering through Gowanus, and I'm interested in how that neighborhood turns out. So it's extremely important to me. Those people that live there will be shopping, in the same stores that I do, going to the same barber shop that I do. So it's important to me that, we put together as best a neighborhood as we can that incorporates as many of the needs that neighborhood has, which includes light industrial use, includes residential, includes the right number of schools, that we solve the problem with regard to, sewers, and all those kinds of things. So all of those things are important to us. Please don't think that they're not. So this is a preliminary presentation from the Department of City Planning. They're going to tell us what they're thinking. Eventually, we'll have an opportunity to tell them what we're thinking. Now, the other thing I want to say is if you're here and you raise your hand and we recognize you, this is an opportunity to ask questions. It's not to say that your opinions aren't important, but this is an important opportunity for you to gather information as well. So, don't feel that you need to pound your fist on the head next to you and say, this is what I think, and if you don't do this, I'm going to do this. Ask a question. Find out more about what concerns you. Find out what city planning thinks, and then we'll take those opinions and we'll run with them when the time comes. So again, thank you all for coming, and I'm going to turn it over to Mark.
Hello, I'm Mark Shames. I'm new to this. I just became the chair of the committee very recently. I'm happy that you all turned out. I know that you're anxious to see what's going to happen. Some of you are anxious in a bad way. Some of you are anxious in a good way. Some of you are anxious in a neutral way. But we want to hear from all of you. This is not new to the community board. We did our first resolution with regard to bridging Gowanus back on December 10th of 2014. This has been a long process. The process has played out in many ways as we asked city planning to play it out. But now comes the real crunch time in this process, and they have given us the opportunity before there is a scoping, before there is an EIS, before there is a certification, for us to further weigh in on the specifics. So I'm pleased that they're here. They have a fairly long presentation. I'm going to shut up. I ask that you limit your questions to 3 minutes, or questions and answers to 3 minutes, so we can hear from as many of you as possible. We are going to forego our committee members as questioners so that we can hear from the community, and then only if the community gets heard will we go back to our committee. So thank you for being here, and Jonathan Keller will take over with city plan.
Thank you. There's actually been a lot of thank yous, but also from us at City Planning and also the city agencies, thank you to CB6 for having us tonight, and also all of you who aren't with CB6 for coming out. This is an important next step, and we're here to, actually Peter and Mark did a really good intro to give informational presentation. It's informational because we haven't started that public review or environmental review yet. And that's because 2+ years ago, you asked us all to come early and come often and talk to you about sort of how, as the plan evolves and as we have proposals to share, to come up before anything formally starts so that you all have enough time to digest and ask questions and help shape and refine this as we move forward. So that's why we're here, to take this next step to talk about how Gowanus can be a more inclusive and sustainable and mixed-use neighborhood for generations to come, which actually, before we launch in, it is a long presentation, is a good point to note that many of us have taken time out of our day from our jobs and our families and our hobbies, what have you, to come here to talk about the future. We really care about our city. We care about our neighborhoods. A lot of people can't show up, and they hopefully are also watching at home. But we're here to talk about the future and how we can not only better it for ourselves, but also for future generations and our kids. And so that's actually really fundamental to everything that we propose and that we think about. We're thinking about how the future can play out. And so the future that the proposal would help facilitate as one of thousands of low-income housing units for low-income New Yorkers and jobs. And it would also mean new open space and schools for the community. It would also mean, along with other strategies, that Gowanus becomes a more sustainable and resilient neighborhood. But the zoning proposal would also make it possible for broader investments that are not, getting out of the way from these people over here on the left, possible just through zoning. That is really important, that zoning is, as we said, and also when we began this in 2016, it's not just about zoning, there's more to the overall plan that we're working towards. And I know, and we've heard, that not everything that everybody wants is here yet, and there's a lot still to do. And that's also partly because we're here early in the process, and we're still working on a lot of things that we'll start touching on throughout the presentation. But I also just want to put a fine point on it, and that also includes NYCHA, and that includes the area outside of the rezoning area as well. That's part of the neighborhood, and really undergirds our thinking. So an overview of the proposed actions that we're proposing are zoning map amendments, and those are basically changing the underlying zoning districts of the neighborhood. A zoning text amendment to actually help modify, because Gowanus is unique, the underlying zoning districts, the text, city map changes, which really is focused on parks and streets, and then a UDAP actions actually too for the facilitation to redevelop city-owned sites. So tonight we're going to give an overview of how we got here, especially since there's a lot of new folks in the room. It's important to bring people along. But we're also talking about what specifically the zoning would do, also stuff that zoning can't do, how are we thinking about that, and also the next steps. And again, before we launch into a few things, it's important that we also talk about some of the realities that are facing us in the city. We are in a citywide housing crisis that's partly exacerbated by the success of a thriving and diversifying economy. And Gowanus is situated around, or within, a number of thriving neighborhoods of Carroll Gardens, Borum Hill, and Park Slope. But it also needs substantial amounts of remediation and brownfield cleanups. And it's also the focus of a lot of market pressure for new development, which in and of itself also requires infrastructure to support that growth. And lastly, because today a lot of our thinking is about how we can fight climate change. Really a key strategy, not just here but throughout the country, really is in terms of fighting climate change, growing denser, locating homes and new jobs next to transit is a critical strategy in doing that. And so one of the key inhibitors of realizing and overcoming those issues and challenges and realizing the vision, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is also that there's outdated existing zoning here. It was put in place in 1961. Up until then, Gowanus was actually a naturally occurring mixed-use neighborhood where residences were being built next to shops and businesses. But since 61, the zoning that was put in place is quite onerous. There's low densities. It doesn't allow people to do the things that they want to do with their properties. It also has high parking requirements next to mass transit, which is also a disincentive for a lot of the properties to do their cleanup of the brownfields. So when we said, okay, we have these challenges, we have these realities facing ourselves, we have a world that is volatile, uncertain, and changing more rapidly than it did in the past, how do we get from here to talking about where we want the future to go, and also how do we shape that future? Well, we started with looking at a lot of the most recent studies and reports, and actually this is just what can fit on one slide. Actually, Gowanus has been the focus of a lot of folks of this neighborhood since the 70s about what to do with it, how to clean it up, what should it be, who should it be for. Really important conversations, and we're actually part of that long conversation that we've been having. And most recently, before our study launched, Bridging Gowanus, which Community Board 6 talked about, that was led by council members Brad Lander and Stephen Levin. But when we launched in 2016 of October, we came to you all and the community board, and we asked, how should we go about studying this neighborhood? And what we heard clearly was also one, and why we're here today, come early and come often. Make sure that we have a early chance to give our thoughts and opinions on things before a lot of the formal stuff kicks in, where there's continuous feedback and input from the community, but come early. Also realize and embrace the fact that in Gowanus, everything is a priority. Everybody wants everything to be done, and that's legitimate, and there's a lot of important folk that want different aspects that also kind of come up and butt up against each other. So we also heard, make sure to create a process where we can hear from each other in the same room, talk about trade-offs, talk about how we may have differences of opinion, and we took that to heart, and we created a process that lasted over 2 years of engagement. Obviously, we're early and it's still ongoing, but what we call listen and learn phase lasted for quite a while. And had a number of large and small meetings, a lot of input from various stakeholders, and also us as an agency, City Planning, launching our first pilot engagement platform called Plan Gowanus. And so we had a number of large format events over the past couple of years where we talked about and wrestled with challenges. We also got ideas about solutions, and we shared out results. We also regularly attended when the NYCHA Tenant Association meetings were held. We went to them and listened to them and gave them updates and briefed them and got feedback on their concerns. We also met often and came to the community board, who have been instrumental in helping not just create the process with us, but also a number of the things that are in the framework and the zoning proposal. They've been instrumental in helping give us that feedback and input. We also, and this was pretty incredible to be a part of, had an open call to create working group meetings. I think maybe all of the working group members are almost in this room. There's a substantial amount are here. And working groups, typically, if they're done, you try to have 10 to 20 members to have like really intimate conversations. In Gowanus, we didn't have less than 20. Our first working group meeting for economic development had 70 folks show up in the IBZ. It really a testament to people wanting to do deep dives, which is what we did for 6 months. We talked about different topics, and then we also together mutually created these goals and objectives that helped inform some of the work we'll talk about in a second. Along with all those different ways of getting input, we also recognize that a lot of people can't devote all that time during the day or at night to come out to things. Actually, I'm here, but in my other life, I'm actually a new father of 3. I have 5-month-old twins. I can't, in my own neighborhood, go out to night meetings when I'm not working, thanks to my wife who's at home right now. And Plan Gowanus was a way to broaden the sources and voices that could give input to this process. That was very helpful, and it also acted as a place for us to share out information during the working group process, archive notes, archive the documents and presentations that were going on. This multi-year, inclusive, and expansive outreach and engagement approach led us to a longer than we probably envisioned when we first started out framework that was 118 pages. And the Gowanus Framework, for a lot of you, if you're new, is a comprehensive framework of goals and strategies that also includes land use recommendations for changes to land use in the neighborhood, which we'll talk about in a second. But at a high level, it's a snapshot in time. It's organized by goals and strategies and is focused on community priorities of sustainability and resiliency and remediation, cultural and community resources, housing, job development, transportation, land use. And it really is a roadmap or a plan for a plan, as I've said before in different places, to help us achieve a collective vision, which is required of all of us to sort of act as well. It has been useful in our own agency work, our interagency work, and also with working with community organizations toward advancing different priorities and goals and strategies identified in the framework. And so since June, when we released the Gowanus Framework, we have made good progress on a number of goals and strategies. We shared this in January and then again at the open house. Then there's much more detailed information on our website. And really this slide is just to note that this is a progress report and that we continue to work with folks in the community. It is not meant to show this is the final plan. This is all very early. This isn't the culmination or the end of our collective efforts to advancing the framework. And really, we're excited to continue working on things that aren't on here, things that actually weren't even in the framework. If you're new to this and coming to us, please come to us with your own thoughts and priorities and how we can work on them together. There was a robust land use framework that sought to support a lot of the overall goals and strategies of different chapters and different topics of the framework, but in particular, it sought to support sustainability and resiliency, strengthening job clusters in the neighborhood, also allowing housing in appropriate areas and also requiring affordable housing, and also promoting an active and resilient waterfront. It also considered the urban design principles and regulations to consider the neighborhood context. And so from that, as you can see as it builds, we use the land use framework to then develop the draft zoning proposal, which we will start getting into now. So at the highest level, this is the zoning proposal. And we'll start getting into the nitty-gritty, but at the highest level, we're increasing density for job-generating non-residential uses and eliminating parking next to mass transit. We're also allowing for residential at medium to moderate density districts in appropriate locations and requiring a portion of any new development where residential is allowed in the future to have permanently affordable housing for low-income New Yorkers. We also, the zoning proposal will help shape a resilient and active waterfront, but also promote a mix of uses throughout the neighborhood, and this is on a neighborhood-wide scale, but also in new mixed-use developments. And then it also takes into account, as we'll talk further with different sort of parts of the zoning proposal, adjacent contexts and the urban design principles I mentioned. So jumping into industrial and commercial, we are proposing new moderate density M districts to strengthen existing nodes and job clusters near mass transit. The thing about existing zoning today is that you don't have a continuum of manufacturing districts. That's what M districts are. Right now, it's a 2 FAR district, and then you jump to a 5. And to actually pause here, FAR, for folks who are new to this, although CB6, I would probably say like 80% of you already know what FAR is. But FAR is floor area ratio. It's the backbone of zoning. It basically is a ratio that is, when applied to a piece of land, you multiply it by the size of it, and that's how much development you can do on that piece of property, which is a gross overstatement of what FAR is. There's another aspect, and a lot of aspects of zoning. One of them is also envelopes, which we'll start talking about here. Envelopes is basically a term to signify once you have that amount of development on a particular site, the envelope helps shape what the potential building form would be. And so for our proposal here, for the moderate density M districts, we're proposing a range from 2 FAR to 4 FAR. The baseline of retail and entertainment uses would stay at 2, but other job-generating uses would increase to 3 or 4 in the 3 or 4 proposed districts. The envelopes would allow 4 to 5-story buildings in the 2 FAR district, and in the 3 and 4, it would go to 6 to 8 and 9 to 11. Depending on the area, the 4 FAR district is just proposed in one place, which is adjacent to Union Street R Station between 3rd and 4th Avenue. The upland mixed use, we are proposing to pair residential districts with those new moderate density M districts to help strengthen the mixed use character, to help reinforce the live-work nature of the neighborhood, but also using the various districts, which we'll get into. There's a scale, a sliding scale from lower to higher density here, trying to balance between neighborhood scale and encouraging growth, where we can also leverage development opportunities for affordable housing and a number of other shared goals that we talked about and are in the framework. So the specs here, the essentials are for the M2 R6B, the residential FAR would be 2.2, and that would produce potentially 4 to 5 story buildings. The R6A and R7A pairings, they would be paired with the 3 FAR moderate density M district. These would have a 3.6 residential FAR and a 4.6 residential FAR respectively. And in the R6A could produce 6 to 8 story buildings, and R7A 7 to 9. The MR7A district is proposed on Union Street, which is a wide street. It's an important east-west connector with connections between 2 neighborhoods and the subway. And the R6A district, slightly less than the R7A, is proposed for side streets in certain mid-blocks. Also important to say, now that we're talking about residential, is also wherever we're allowing for residential in the neighborhood, it comes with a requirement for mandatory inclusionary housing, which is a requirement for permanently affordable housing to be provided in new developments. And the market rate residential parking would be 20%. Enhanced mixed use, a key goal to focus on that we heard during the process is how to keep Gowanus funky and mixed use, and we had a lot of conversations about the best way to do that, hearkening back to a number of working group meetings, and I can actually see the folks that we were talking with then. We talked about there are different ways to do that and at different scales, and so in the neighborhood scale we're doing that by having the M-only areas and the non-residential only areas, but where we're also allowing for residential, we want to promote the mixing of uses in new developments. And so a sort of case study, a crucial spot in the neighborhood is Thomas Green Playground. Very important park. Today it's a residential park. It's heavily used by NYCHA residents. It's also surrounded by brownfields and also former industrial warehouses. And so when we took a look at this, we also in mind of keeping the mixed-use character, which, this is a very unique condition, a residential park surrounded by non-residential uses. We wanted to make sure that, we could support the revitalization of the park and the surrounding areas and clean up the brownfields, but also make sure that it was not having residential lobbies and amenities fronting on this space that's historically been surrounded by non-residential uses. And so we came up with the M14R7X proposal, which has a maximum total FAR of 6.0. It has a residential max, though, of 5.6, and the non-residential max is 4.0. The only way to get up to 6.0 is to provide non-residential uses in those buildings through 2 use incentives, which we can get into, and in particular at a high level. The one of them is a non-residential use at a wide spectrum. Another one, the second one, is a more refined list that reflects the Gowanus uses that are out in the neighborhood today. What's more, we're also looking at this area around the park to also have ground floor use requirements. This will do two things. One, it'll make sure that there are non-residential uses provided fronting on this park. It'll activate the streetscape, but it also means that it'll stack with the use incentives, meaning that we'll get, is the hope, second-story non-residential uses as well. So the feeling around this park will actually be quite active. There will be a lot of space, and especially second-story space is typically lower rents, and hopefully can be for a wider range of non-residential uses as well. There are two residential-only districts that we're proposing. One is on Warren Street. This is currently built up as row homes. This is contextualizing that. Currently it's an R6 non-contextual district. We're proposing R6B. And proposing R6A on Mary Star of the Seas parking lot to help facilitate opportunities for low-income senior housing on that site. And the FARs similar are 2.2 and 3.6 in those two districts, although for low-income senior housing, it's 3.9, which is a higher FAR. Along 4th Avenue, which was rezoned in 2003, we are proposing a commercial district, the C44D, which is a R9A, which will have a R9A equivalent. We're also allowing active uses to replace ground floor parking spaces to help with activating the streetscape. A lot of folks, actually after the 2003 rezoning, saw new developments with blank facades, and so we came back in 2011, made the first enhanced commercial district in the city that said you're required to do commercial uses on 4th Avenue, which is why new developments actually have activated the ground floor, but the older ones still have those blank facades. Now we're saying if you would like to activate those spaces that were built with parking, you can do so if it's an active use. We're also mapping what we're calling transit easement zones along 4th Avenue to help with improvements for the subways there, to make space for ADA and other improvements that are necessary in the future. In particular, the district on 4th Avenue would have a 3.4 commercial FAR, 6.5 for community facility, and 8.5 for residential. This would allow us to get mandatory inclusionary housing on 4th Avenue, which was rezoned in 2003 to R8A. That did not at the time have any affordability incentives or requirements. We didn't have voluntary inclusionary housing, let alone mandatory inclusionary housing. So the rezoning would be able to make sure that going forward, new development would have mandatory inclusionary housing, and a permanently affordable housing would be generated along 4th Avenue. Oh, thank you. The stories, yes, the stories are from 12 to 17 stories. Thank you. We're also establishing what is called the Gowanus Mixed-Use Special District, which is allowing us to create special rules throughout the neighborhood on the Canal Blocks and on upland blocks for height and setback regulations, which is the envelope that I mentioned before, but also for parking use and floor area regulations. We've talked about some of those. This map shows to the right, which is a little bit, it's bled out through the projector. It's showing non-residential ground floor requirements, as we talked about around the park, but also on 3rd Avenue and 4th Avenue, and commercial requirements, which are at the canal crossings, which serve a similar purpose to around the park, which we'll get into in the next couple of slides when we talk about the Canal District. So the Canal Subdistrict, which actually my colleague Sagi is going to delve into a lot more fine grain to talk about a lot of the thoughtful work we've done to talk about how it works with the adjacent context and how we got to the maximum heights that we're proposing. But the basics of what we're proposing is a M3, the moderate density 3 FAR manufacturing district, paired with an R7-2. It has a maximum, this is similar to the R7X districts and around Thomas Green Playground, has a maximum FAR of 5.0, but the residential maximum is 4.4 FAR, and the non-residential is 3.0. The only way to get up to 5.0 is to include a mix of uses, the non-residential uses, the incentives that we talked about, the two of them, the wider range and then the smaller range. We'll get into the height and setbacks and the maximum in a little bit. The canal crossings will also have required ground floor uses, and this does two things. I think, yeah. It does two things. One, similar to around the park, but in particular around the canal crossings, the bridges are going to be the doorways to this incredible new resilient waterfront open space, and so we want to make sure that that flows, that it's inviting, that people feel invited in, but also helping people get in and around some of these bridges which have tiebacks. And so the intent is to help with that sort of flow up and around the bridges, but it also, similar to around the park, is our way to help promote a active and mix of uses on the canal blocks, which we heard a lot from folks. So the ground floor requirement cannot be stacked with the incentive uses. You can't use incentive uses to satisfy the requirement. So what we hope to get is those commercial spaces on the ground floor and then more above or where they can fit, so that we're actually activating, we have a more mixed use canal than just residential. Within the canal subdistrict, there is a large, currently vacant-owned city site, colloquially called Public Place, but also known as Gowanus Green. This site, we had a public workshop in the fall on. Many of you were there to refresh the vision for it. It was also the focus of work about 10 years ago with a development team that also worked with us in November to help refresh it, and here we're able to do a lot more affordable housing, and there's a mix of uses contemplated along with community facility uses, commercial space, and new open space. And in particular, other than the baseline, and I bring this up, other than the baseline, which we already talked about, which is the M13 R72 district, we're also proposing mapping of new parkland on the site, along with the disposition of the site to allow for it to be redeveloped, along with mapping of new streets, which will help break down the largeness of it, which is about a 5 to 6 acre site right now. This is a summary of the proposed city map changes. We're proposing to remove the public place designation, but map new parkland on that same site. Mapping of new streets through these two large sites that currently don't have any streets. Also mapping of parkland on the Bond Street street end that's south of 4th Street. And then also demapping of a street, which is a cleanup of a street that was never built on the private site to the south of Public Place. And now I'll turn it over to my colleague Sagi, who's going to walk through a little bit more about the canal blocks and also the waterfront access plan, which is very important to this.
Hey everyone, I'm Sagi. So before we delve into the actual proposal, we thought it would be important to kind of establish a bit of information about the toolbox that we have in our zoning to establish waterfront access plan and because I'm going to use a little bit of jargon, so it would be important to kind of share a little bit about the tools that we have. So really thinking about waterfront zoning as a whole and citywide, it originated in 1992 when the city released its comprehensive waterfront plan. We really established the public's right to the water, and it's really important to think about Gowanus in that sense, making sure that it really aligns with the citywide goals. In Vision 2020, the city furthered its goal and really established core values and core design tools to further quality public access on the waterfront. There is some considerations on, high quality design, that our waterfront public access are inviting, they're green, they're ecologically sustainable and also resilient in the long term. A little bit about waterfront zoning as a whole, the tools that we have in our disposal. You could generally divide them into 4 buckets. There are applicability, right? What properties along the waterfront has to provide waterfront access. There are considerations about bulk, how buildings kind of touch the waterfront. There are considerations about the actual public access, how much you can provide or you need to provide, how you connect that space to the city itself, and then how you design it. It by no means means to this is how you design it, but there are minimum standards and design requirements that you have to meet to make sure that it's accessible and equitable. So a little bit about applicability. When you develop a new development or you enlarge or you change of use of an existing development, you have to provide waterfront access. Generally, developments within the Gowanus, when they come to be developed under the proposed zoning, will have to provide waterfront access. There are also dimensional requirements. Lots have to be over 10,000 square feet and have a shoreline of over 100 linear feet as well. In terms of the space, the actual public access space, one is really establishing the space along the waterfront. That's called the waterfront yard. That is usually measured from the mean high water or the stabilized shoreline. And within that space, usually you have the shore public walkway. That is generally 40 feet. Within the waterfront public access, there are the various components that create the actual physical space. One, the shore public walkway usually is within the waterfront yard along the waterfront. The upland connections usually are in the elongation of the existing grids, the street grid. They usually provide and facilitate access, physical access of the public from upland streets, basically connecting the city to the waterfront through public land. There are also visual corridors. Usually they are in conjunction with the upland connections. They provide visual access to the water. Sometimes we have visual corridors mapped through public land, through private land to the water to just facilitate additional visual access to the water. Finally, supplemental public access areas are additional areas that I will explain a little bit more later how they're conceptualized, but those are additional areas within the waterfront. So usually the upland connection and the shore public walkway, so upland connection connecting the city to the waterfront to the shore public walkway, and the shore public walkway constitute 15 to 20% of your private lot. That lot, that percentage is determined by the floor area. As floor areas go higher, the percentage gets to 20. The supplemental is established in the case where upland connections and the shore public walkway together, the area does not meet the percentage requirement. When those do not meet, you have to provide additional space. Usually that has to be located alongside the shore public walkway. And in terms of the design requirements, those establish minimum quality. They refer to actually the amount that you need to provide. It has to have a certain amount of trees, certain amount of benches, clear paths so people could walk, the amount of seating and types of seating. And then there are design standards. Design standards refer to the quality of those amenities. So seatings that have backs have to have a certain recline that it's comfortable to sit in. But they also speak to other types of amenities that different waterfront access plans could cater and create. And finally, bulk controls, we will talk a little bit more, is really how buildings touch the waterfront. And those generally have a generous setback from the waterfront to make sure that plenty of light and air is reaching to the open space, that building base remain a little bit lower, and then there is a setback, and then beyond that there are buildings rising higher up to a certain limit based on the floor area proposed for the site. So Waterfront Access Plan is basically taking all of these tools that I just mentioned and placing it into a specific geography. And why we do that is that we do find that, not all waterfronts are the same, and we have canals and we have other locations around the city that really warrant a unique treatment and a little bit more predictability of what the rules and waterfront rules can produce. So, in our city, we have other waterfronts like in Greenpoint, Williamsburg, and Inwood, and Flushing. All of them have different waterfront access plans today. They're very different, and they're all like very different conditions. As you see, for example, Gowanus versus Greenpoint, Williamsburg really warrant different treatments, and they have different opportunities to look, if you look at the scale here. So, what guided the development of the Waterfront Access Plan? As Jonathan mentioned, we've been working on this for many years, and this is not the first time the Gowanus Canal has been contemplated as being accessible and open as a waterfront. And so we really developed these guiding principles and that we shared in the framework in order to, guide the way that we form regulations. Because, yes, regulations could be a little bit dry, but then in the end of the day, it really facilitates hopefully the best outcome. So really thinking about citywide objectives and how the Gowanus, it is a water body that is connected to the rest of the water body, and to the city and the bay, and also how it could be ecologically functioning, how it could be resilient, how it could facilitate a diverse outcome. People wanted to see a lot of variety of experiences along the canal. It's not a big canal, but it could actually be very exciting. And so we wanted to capitalize on that. So if you look at the existing conditions, the canal, actually you could look at it as three different segments, and I'll mention upper canal, mid canal, and lower canal a little bit more, but just to try to distinguish some of the areas. Upper canal, as you can see, has a little bit more constrained site, a little bit more narrow streets around it, Bond and Nevins, and adjacencies to lower context on both sides. Mid canal has actually deeper sites that provide a different type of opportunity. There are actually larger sites. You can provide larger open spaces there. We also have the first street turning basin that would be restored and daylighted as part of the Superfund cleanup, so that it really is a unique opportunity there. And then lower canal is where public places and our larger sites are, and so there is really a great opportunity to really think differently about these areas. So touching out a little bit about the bulk and how they're shaped to relate to the waterfront. So it was really, really important to us to share with you a little bit about the guiding principles behind the proposed bulk of the canal and how we got to the heights we've got. So what was really key, as I mentioned, is really setting back as much as you can from the waterfront. So buildings would have to be set back from the waterfront. Any additional height beyond the base height have to be set back. There is also adjacent context. Nevin's a little bit different than Bond Street, but really thinking about those streets as being able to just drop and set back, similar to if you see how the Lightstone development actually fronts that street, so something similar. But having said that, we really wanted to also have flexibility to have building and courtyards of these private property to have the ability to open up. And also be able to have various building forms. So if you go up in one location, you'll run out of floor area and you'll have to drop down. That's the relationship between floor area and envelope. And really thinking about light and air to the corridor. So any additional height, and I'll mention it very soon, any additional height has to be located in one specific space and point in the block, so that plenty of light and air could get to the courtyard as well. So the proposed envelopes are a little bit different in each segment of the canal based on the adjacencies, and we really carefully looked at the adjacencies and tried to be as respectful to the context as possible. But generally in the upper canal along Bond Street, you're going to be allowed to go between 5 to 6 stories. Along the whole canal, you can go up to 6 stories. Along Nevin Street, you can go up between 6 and 8 stories. And any portion above above 8 stories is defined as the additional height for the block, and that will have different controls in order to make sure that the flexibility and variety is achieved throughout the canal. Yes, you can get to one point to 22 stories, but that doesn't happen in all blocks and everywhere. If you go up, you have to go down in other locations. And then one thing to note on the lower canal block, this is a very large site along Huntington Street. The diagram here on the right, looking at one location where you can go up to 30 stories. That site is actually encumbered by a sewer easement and cannot be built on, and so that's a location where additional height we found appropriate. Looking at the pedestrian experience, you've seen this image multiple times, but really thinking about, this shows a little bit about how buildings sit back and how there are visual corridors through Nevin Street allowing connectivity to the First Street turning basin and a larger amount of open space on the Third Street side as well. Touching back on the flexibility, really, we wanted to provide a more flexible envelope, making sure that we don't have a cookie-cutter approach. These are all permutation that could happen. There are many others that could happen, but really thinking about different build forms to make sure that good architecture could happen, that buildings could open up to the canal, and you have a variety of open spaces provided. And again, showing, from a pedestrian perspective, how it is important to keep the base low of the canal, and because you're keeping the base low, other portions of the site might need to go taller. So go back to the ground plane, a little bit about public access. Generally, when you, on the sites that are proposed to be 5 FAR, on the canal sites, the mixed-use sites, 20% of the total lot area would have to be created as publicly accessible esplanade. And then for canal sites that we have a few that are 3 FAR, the non-residential, if they are to be developed, the 15% requirement would be 8. In terms of the shore public walkway, on regular sites, we are proposing a 40-foot shore public walkway, and then on shallower site or more irregular sites, a 30-foot shore public walkway. Visual corridors, upland connection, street mapping, all of these are facilitating public access, visual and physical access to the waterfront, generally at the elongation of the grid through private property. Sackett President is one example. And then visual corridors to the First Street turning basin, to this new amenity that will be restored in the future, and also note the street mapping that Jonathan mentioned as well. As I mentioned, supplemental public access is going to be required for sites that the upland connection and the shore public walkway would not meet the 20% requirement. We have some opportunity, sites north of north of Union. There is an opportunity. These are not large supplemental public access areas, but there is an opportunity for either widening the shore public walkway or creating a consolidated area at the street ends. On the mid-canal, there is an opportunity for great larger open space on the site on 3rd Avenue and 3rd Street, and then on the turning basin as well, providing access there. And then to complement the proposed park mapping, really a widened shore public walkway on the largest site on Smith Street. And then really one thing that we're very excited about is the turning basin. This is going to be a new amenity, a lot of investment to daylight it. We think it is really appropriate to actually have access around it. It will facilitate access to 3rd Avenue and also around and then down the waterfront towards the 3rd Street Bridge. So this is really exciting, and so a 20-foot shore public walkway would be required there. And then street ends. These are kind of the links that we feel would stitch it all together. So the waterfront access plan would require the street ends to be designed with the shore public walkway as a continuation. So the WAP will facilitate their improvement as basically a continuation of the shore public walkway. We also want to keep drainage and resiliency in mind. We feel that we know that these play a critical role, and so we are going to work with our sister agencies and developers to find the best plan for each of the street ends to function in the best way it can. And then design. Really looking at three large buckets. We're not going to go into really percentages, but looking at how we can promote a resilient waterfront. So one key element is really looking at the elevation of the shore public walkway and making sure that it withstands long-term daily tidal flooding. So we want to have a waterfront that in the future is resilient and remains for everybody to enjoy. But we also want to make sure that that regulation does facilitate public access to the water. So making sure that the grading controls are aligned and making sure that if somebody wants to create a bi-level waterfront that we've seen a lot in Greenpoint, Williamsburg, for example, as an interesting approach to keep you connected to the water, but also keep you connected to adjacent uses on the buildings as well. Ecology, I think, we love the lowlands work, we love the Gowanus Canal Conservancy work, and we really want to encourage ecologically sensitive designs. And so really looking at types of planting, the percentage of planting, there is some definition of planting that we need to make sure change or is more flexible to facilitate designs that have a more ecologically waterfront in mind, and also looking at the edge conditions of the waterfront as well. And then programming throughout our workshops and our working group meetings, we've heard loud and clear that we don't want to have just lawns and passive recreation. We want active recreation. We want playgrounds. We want dog runs. We want historic interpretation. All of these things we want to make sure that we promote, allow, and even incentivize. So we want to make sure that the variety of experiences are facilitated through our zoning. And then just to summarize, really, we think that the Waterfront Access Plan is really an exciting opportunity to shape a future esplanade. We're looking at 6 to 7 acres of open space, 5 to 7 acres of open space along the canal and in the park. So it really is going to be a great new amenity, and we really want to work with you to make this right. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're towards the end, and so just to recap, to facilitate a lot of what we had just said, including the Waterfront Access Plan, we're proposing zoning map amendments, text amendments, city map changes, and UDAPs. And this will help facilitate thousands of new homes for low-income New Yorkers and new jobs, open space, schools, and a resilient shoreline, and a more sustainable and resilient Gowanus. And also, while this has been a lot of slides on draft zoning, we are clear that zoning is not the only part of the plan, and that we're also able to make possible broader investments in the community as well. And in particular, our immediate next step, along with actually taking question and answers and meeting with many of you over the next few weeks, including the coalition, is to begin environmental review. A lot of questions I'm sure we'll get tonight are on specifics about how much and how many schools seats we need, and what about open space and transit and traffic. we're going to get those answers, and we're going to do the analysis. And now that we have the proposed zoning, we can actually do an analysis to give you that information. The first step in doing that is getting your input on actually how to do that analysis. So it's a really iterative step that we have our what we call a scoping meeting, which we're hoping to tentatively have in April, where the community can come and give us their comments on how we are proposing to analyze all this. And I see Karen nodding, and I'm sure I'm going to get really good comments on the draft scope of work to sort of talk about how we should do the analysis in Gowanus. And also written comments will be accepted as well. But that's the immediate sort of technical work that we're doing as a next step, but also we are excited to continue working with many of you on non-zoning aspects that will really help make this, as we move forward, a neighborhood plan. So, thank you.
Okay. You can hold on to that because we talked. Well, now we come to the part where you get to actively participate. The questions will be from this microphone. If you just come on up and make an orderly line, please try to keep it as short as possible. Certainly no more than 3 minutes. I'm very glad that Jonathan ended with the statement about things that go beyond the zoning, because those things have been very important to the community board. As we said, we're going to farm out to our various committee in things such as transportation and public safety and other aspects of this, so that we can then bring them together in front of the land use committee and get something that is comprehensive. So, without further ado, come and ask questions. Obviously, be polite. Thank you so much. Hold on. Maybe Peter wants to say something else? Okay, Peter. All right, so please step forward. There you go.
Good evening, all. This is Karen from the Gowanus Neighborhood Coalition for Justice. GNCJ.org. You can go online now, gncj.org. So my first question is, will the city commit to starting construction on the $4 million renovation of the Gowanus Houses Community Center before ULUP begins? And will the city provide funding for Know Your Rights for not just people living outside of public housing who fear displacement, but for public housing residents as well? And training designed for public housing residents. So we want to know about building systems, since all these buildings are going up. We want to know about water and how water is captured and why we have these overflows in the canal to begin with. So we want to know about water, like drainage from our sinks and our toilets, all the way to the canal, so that we can better understand how to conserve water and to point out deficiencies and leaks in our buildings, so that we could, together create a resiliency plan in this community. We're also asking if city planners are considering proposing transferring of development rights from NYCHA properties in Gowanus to fund repairs. We want to know about those things. You got that?
I'm starting to get a pen.
Okay. Well, I can give you a copy of our questions, but you have to answer them.
The first 4? Yeah. All right. But at least I got a takeaway that I can take home with me. So the first one was related to the Gowanus Community Center, which we were happy to share an update on, and some of the history actually on this, which is a happy story, a good story that we were happy to share. Is when we first started in 2016, one of the very first things that the yet-to-be coalition, actually, it was not the coalition just yet, Fifth Avenue Committee and others, and in our working groups really advocated for was the Gowanus Community Community Center, which had been and remains not open and available for the residents there. And it's been a long time, and we heard that. And in 2017, at a mayoral town hall, the mayor made a commitment to reopening it. At the time, the specifics were, not as great as we have today. The update in January was that we understand there's $4 million that have been allocated for that, and the next step is for, I believe, DYCD and the other folks that are working on it to do community engagement before the renovations begin. The specific question about before ULURP or not, I don't have right now, but it's a good question, and I can take that back and get an answer. And what was the second question? There's like sub-bullets here. So the second question was for,
Fund, know your rights for public housing residents,
Sure.
as well as help us to get training on building systems.
Yep.
And so that way we could alleviate some of
Sure.
the excess water that's leaking all over our buildings, and that's also creating more overflow in the canal.
There's a couple of, the first part, I think I want to talk to you more about, understanding more about that. The second part about training, one of the updates we did talk about, which, and there's more to training, and there's more to workforce training, but particularly that we were happy to share was that Small Business Services is launching a mobile outreach for training, which can go anywhere, but also particularly here, focusing on NYCHA communities, and we're happy to share that in January, and also actually touch base on how we can focus that outreach and training that SBS can help with. And then I think the fourth question, and I know all of you are waiting patiently, so I'm trying to get to it as quick as possible, is the transfer of development rights from NYCHA. That is not part of our proposal, but it's something that we hear now from you, and we can take back. It's complicated, is what I would say, and we've looked at a lot of different things, but it's not part of our proposal.
Good evening. First of all, my name is Steve Fontes. I am a resident of Carroll Gardens, and thank you for your proposal. Thank you for your presentation, rather. It was pretty thorough.
Sorry, I didn't catch your name. Sorry.
Steve
Hi, Steve.
Fontes. Hi. So I have two questions, really. The first thing I'd like to say is that we have a large ditch which cuts our community board right down Hick Street. It's I-278, the Gowanus. And when I looked at your canal zoning area, I couldn't help but think that it was the same effect, except in reverse. You're proposing 300-foot buildings along the canal. The largest building currently along the canal is 505 Court Street, which is 120 feet and towers above the Gowanus. You're going to propose buildings that are double that height along the length of the canal. That's concerning, very concerning, because essentially you're going to split this neighborhood. And I understand a lot of thought has been given to the creation of a vibrant waterfront community, and I appreciate that. I like that. I'm kind of thinking along the lines of the Riverwalk in San Antonio. You guys did a great job with that. But I'm really concerned about the height. You're going to have these enormous buildings, the height of buildings in downtown Brooklyn, lining the canal, where there was nothing contextual about that, not even close. It's horrible. And so my first question is, are these zoning regulations set in stone, or can they change? Okay, let me get to my second question. It's very, very simple. I'd just like to know, I'm also a business owner in the neighborhood. I employ residents of the neighborhood. We're actually working on the restoration and revitalization of Gowanus houses right now. So we're very invested in this neighborhood as a company and me as an individual. I'd like to know if there is a net gain or a net loss in manufacturing area. as a result of the rezoning of this neighborhood, because I'm very concerned as well. It's very difficult to grow business right now with the rezonings that have taken place, because a lot of the rezonings have resulted in landlords who want more of a, I guess you would call it like a creative type of business. You know, I own a construction company, and it's very difficult to operate a construction company off of the fourth floor of a building. I think one of our community board members might agree with me. So I'd like to know what your zoning will do with that. Is there a net loss or a net gain? What are we doing about the industrial business zone? Is the mayor committed to preserving and increasing? Because the jobs we provide are good-paying jobs for a good middle class. We're a union outfit, and we provide a good place for our residents to work in. So I think my time is up. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Steve. Actually, because I'm going to answer your questions, you had a lot of thoughts and good questions, and want to make sure you don't wander too far away in case you need to correct me on what I'm actually responding to. But I think I'll try to work backwards on your questions regarding manufacturing in terms of net loss and net gain, and what are we doing to sort of promote and preserve. Very good questions, and they've been at the heart of a lot of the work that we've done over the past couple of years. We absolutely are committed to reinforcing and preserving the IBZ. That is something we also committed to studying in the Gowanus Framework that we released in June, that we started doing in October, and we are looking forward to doing over the next number of months, is to come up with a vision for how that area can also grow and support more jobs. But we're also within the area that we're studying right now for rezoning. There's the entire area is either zoned M or C8, but the actual number of sort of jobs and manufacturing uses, they're really focused in those areas that we're maintaining for manufacturing and non-residential. Not to say that they're not elsewhere as well, but the activity levels are of a different level, and so that is part of the answer. The other part of the answer is that where we're allowing new residential, we don't want it to be only residential, and that's why we're pairing it with manufacturing districts. So there's no loss of manufacturing districts here. We're basically enhancing a lot of the mixed-use discussions here by requiring and incentivizing non-residential uses, but then saying the IBZ is for more heavier industrial uses, and then these areas for non-residential, the moderate and mid-density proposed districts that we have, where we're hoping to have light industrial and also other uses that are symbiotic with those to sort of enhance that. And then the first question that you had on heights is we've given a lot of thought to heights. It's something we don't take lightly, and the reason why we're, to really paraphrase what a lot of Sagi said much more eloquently, is that we took it very seriously, and it's very sensitive to the adjacent context. We have very low base heights, very strong. You can't go above that, which means when your development you're trying to place it on a site, it has only one where to go. It's like liquid, right? It's a volume, and it has to go somewhere. And when you're trying to promote a number of things, including remediation, affordable housing, and non-residential uses, activating the shoreline, raising it up for sea level rise, that requires development. It requires square footage. And when you keep the base heights really low because you're concerned about adjacent context, it means they can go up high. They go up as high as it can fit, and we're capping it at 22 stories. And the reason being, we want to make sure that it's not on top of those Bond Street and the Canal or Nevin Street. And that's why, but I would also say those actually, 505 Carroll is not the only context. The NYCHA campuses that are actually in the community closer than that particular development actually raise up to about 200 feet as well, and they're definitely part of the context as well. So, yes, one site.
30 stories.
Yeah, there is one site. the public place site and the private site to the south of it, next to Smith and 9th Street, which has additional encumbrances, the sewer easement that cuts through it. That's why it gets essentially a little bit higher. It's because there's less place to put the bulk. So.
Okay. Well, we don't want any back and forth, please. No. A lot of people who want to talk, you had a very good opportunity. The IBZs are important to us. The business community is important to us. We're going to do a lot more on that, a lot more on NYCHA, but everybody wants to get a chance. One question per person from now on, please. And he indicated why the zoning is the way it is. He didn't say it's in stone, but he indicated it's not all that.
That is actually a good question, and sure, on the topic of everybody's mind. It's not in stone. This is a proposal. It's very early. It can be shaped. It can be refined, and that's why we're also here. And yes, thank you. That is a good follow-up. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Debbie Stoller, and I'm here representing the Gowanus Rezone is Dirty, the Gowanus is Dirty politics. It's the gowanusisdirty.com. I went to all of those neighborhood meetings, spent hours and hours of my life and my evenings, and out of all of those meetings, we had a draft proposal presented in June. That proposal was pretty much the same as this. There was the lovely Gowanus Canal walkways and these like mullet buildings where it's like shorter business buildings in the front and like Nightmare Tower in the back. But back then, the towers were 14 stories high. They maxed out at 14 stories high. As soon as that was released, news articles came out that developers were not happy with that. They wanted more. They wanted way more. Now, not everybody might realize that developers on the Gowanus, all of those sites are brownfields. So not only do they not pay taxes for 10 to 15 years like anybody who develops new buildings in New York City, but they also actually get taxpayer money given to them towards the building of their lots. So not just cleaning up the dirt, that gets reimbursed, but actually at 10% and up to $35 million to help build their buildings. So I think that that's a lot that they're getting. This 22-story height, how many of you guys here are upset about that specific thing? The height came up in all of the Gowanus meetings, so I also want to know what happened. Who sold out the neighborhood? Why is what the community decides developers can override?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, we, as I said to Steve's question as well, we've definitely been in lots of conversations over the past couple of years, and there's a lot of discussion and concern about height, and we took that very seriously, which is why the heights actually get that high, because we're keeping them extremely low next to Bond Street.
But that was already in the last presentation, so.
Please, no shouting out. Please be behaved. We know how many people feel. We want to hear how people feel, and I know your mom. And it is absolutely fine that you express your opinion, but it's not fine that you shout out. It's not fine that you act out. You may not like what's happening. Fine. There's a public process. It's going to continue, but please, civility.
But my question was, what happened in between them being 14 stories high and now being 22
I was gonna.
You already had those mullets before.
There wasn't anything that happened. In the framework document that we shared, we talked about there's a range of heights that, depending on the area, that would be looked at. And we talked about heights that were up to 18 to 20 stories. And then when we looked at the zoning, and we actually did the fine-grained analysis that is of massing buildings, looking at how deep the shore public walkway would be, how the FAR was, which we didn't have at the time. That's why it's up to 22 stories, which is slightly different, but it's essentially what we had in the framework.
The developers had their chance to present to you why it should be taller. Will the community ever have a chance to present why it should not be that tall?
We've had a public process, and everybody has given their input, and this is clear that we have really taken to heart this particular concern, and it's actually why one of the reasons why they're actually that high is because we're trying to keep the base heights low.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. My name's Charlie Dorsanio. I live a few blocks away. Love
Hi, Charlie.
Hey, how you doing? So I actually come from a very different perspective. First, want to say, I think a lot of it looks really beautiful. I think DCP's done a great job. So I want to thank you for that. I'm also part of a group called Open New York that works to support housing development across the city because we're in a huge housing crisis. Since 1991, 1.1 million jobs have been created in New York, but less than 500,000 households have been built. So the cost of housing has increased exponentially. So anytime you're worried about height restrictions is really, the cost of height restrictions is higher rents. So we want to applaud the city for increasing any density. And my question is actually, and I'm glad George asked if it was set in stone, why is there any FAR restriction or height restriction at all on 4th Avenue since it has incredible public transit access and is a wide street? It seems like it'd be a great street to just not have any height restrictions at all.
Please, public demonstration, stop it. You know, people know how people feel about various things. She asks that you raise your hand, you raise your hand. That's fine. We're not trying to suppress opinion, but let's give people a chance to answer questions, and there'll be much more process going forward.
So not wanting people to move into your neighborhoods is a lot like what people in the suburbs do. New York should be a place that's open to everybody, and more housing units is how that happens.
Sure. Yes, thank you for your question. We came up with the proposed zoning for 4th Avenue because we felt like it was appropriate for a wide corridor that has mass transit below it, but the size of the lots are a little bit different. We looked at sort of the context both on either side and what could be accommodated based on our urban design principles that we came up with from the framework. It was a guiding document that we used to come up with the draft zoning proposal, not something that we departed from. And one of those things was we were trying to get mandatory inclusionary housing on 4th Avenue, which would require an upzoning to at least an R9A equivalent. And when we looked at the additional height, 12 to 17 stories, and the lot sizes and the adjacent context, we felt like that was the appropriate district.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi everybody, my name is Clarina Betzola and I am I'm here representing the 3 last houses from Bond Street towards the canal on 2nd Street, and actually perhaps you remember me.
Hi, yeah, we met. How are you?
Yeah, we came, Mike King and Melissa, we came, and I'm just kind of asking the same question again because I feel like I didn't get an answer then. So you were talking a lot about the renderings are very beautiful, and thank you for the presentation. You're talking a lot about scaling it down towards the canal, and I know you're talking about scaling it down towards Bond Street, but my question very particularly because my house is the last house before the industrial zone starts. So I am the last house. I'm touching that open field. So what's going to be my reality? And Mike King is right next to us. We have like a nice little, community. Are we going to have a 6-story wall right next to us? And also, particularly, I was asking, that was my first question. My second question is, we had these setbacks and we have backyards. So if the building next to us is going to have a courtyard, are they going to be allowed to put like a big wall for privacy? And we're going to lose all our light and air. So I'm curious about that.
This is very specific. Can we suggest that we talk maybe later about your specific property, because I don't quite understand where you specifically are, and we can answer your questions specifically.
I think he knows, but
Yeah.
but wouldn't it be interesting
No,
for other people?
Sagi wasn't in that meeting. I was, I believe. This
you
was,
were.
I think,
A year ago.
a year ago. Essentially what the zoning is for that particular area, it does have basically height caps that you're more towards Bond, which is a lower height cap of, I believe, 55 to 65. And so in the area where you are, the building buildings wouldn't be be able to go higher than that.
I know, but you were talking about building directly coming up to Bond Street. They would come up to my house, and then what about my setback?
Sure.
And what about that courtyard of theirs? Because that's really important, because that's where I lose all my light.
Yeah, that's a helpful comment to help us clarify. The proposed zoning that is on the Canal Blocks does not mean the entire block gets redeveloped all to 22 stories.
Okay.
Those are conceptual envelopes and conceptual diagrams of what could happen under a assembled site, right? But not all the sites are owned by one owner on a block, including yours, which has a lot more owners, which is why we also have height caps, which means that depending on the site, or if it is developed, which it may or may not be, there is a height cap of 55 feet, which extends in 65 feet. So I believe you would be within that area, and that would be the sort of dictum or datum for that area.
Okay. Do you mind if I come up to you afterwards quickly?
Yes.
Thank you.
If we can't answer it then, again, this is also the next step in our phase. We'll sit down and we'll look at this, we'll overlay the zoning and talk to you about it.
Hello, hear me? So my name is Todd Kimmel. I'm a resident of CB6 in Park Slope. I'm also very concerned about climate change, and I think a lot of people in this room probably are as well, including our mayor. And I was just wondering if there was any consideration with the bulk of buildings that are being considered for the rezoning, discussions around high-performance, low-energy type buildings such as Passive House, and kind of encouraging these types of buildings that require about 90% less energy use and can help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but are also very resilient. And I know resilient is a very common theme in what we're talking about here. These buildings have been shown to allow people to shelter in place during power outages, during weather events, whether or not that's in the height of the summer or in the depths of the winter, particularly for people that are at need for being able to shelter in place and might not have the means to get out. So I'm just curious if that's been part of the discussion.
Sustainability and resiliency has been absolutely at like I said, everything in Gowanus is a priority. It's also been at the heart of the discussion here. And one of the real benefits also of the flexible envelope that we were discussing on the Canal Blocks is it also allows for people to do a lot of those good things with the buildings to make them more resilient and more energy efficient. A lot of times folks can't fit all that in because they come up against the zoning envelope. And so that's one of the benefits that we've baked in, is to allow people to do things that will help actually cause new development to frankly be infrastructure for the future to help with resiliency for the neighborhood.
Okay. I mean, I think that's more about visual, but less about energy use. So I'm kind of more focused on making requirements on reducing energy use in buildings.
In our zoning proposal, we don't have any above what is already in code, which there was also recently, the energy code was just updated, which is why you don't see a lot of those PTECs in the windows. You see actually more weather-proofed and efficient buildings. In this proposal, we haven't gone beyond that.
Okay. All right.
My name is Georgia Parks, and I was an RN at Long Island College Hospital for 50 years before I lost my job and my health care to developments similar to that. And a lot of us can see what they've put in there. But the area that I'm talking about right now is the area that I live, which is right near Smith and 9th Street, Nelson, Huntington, Lower Court. We are pitched downward. And judging by the size of the building that's going by the Huntington Street area, which I'm a block from, it's a massive building. My house is the first house that greets the backing up Gowanus and storm drain when a heavy rain comes. And all that water runs down, and there's no permeable place for that water to be sucked up into. So when these buildings come, where is the stormwater runoff going? And the second part of the question is, because I live right by the subway, vast numbers of people come from outside the neighborhood, park by the Smith and 9th Street subway, and take the subway into the city. Now, I know that the move is to try to get to bicycles. I'm 70 and I can't do grocery shopping from a bicycle. But we can't wish away cars. And we need housing, but housing comes with vehicles. And where are the vehicles and where is the water going to go? Because we can't handle the cars and the water now. So what are we doing to offset those problems?
Sure. Thank you for your question. Absolutely, those are two important focal points for us in terms of resiliency and stormwater, but also parking. Both of those are sort of key components to a sustainable neighborhood. For that particular area, actually, one of the benefits of larger sites is if they are redeveloped, they actually have a requirement to hold on to stormwater runoff. So actually, the future, which today the current context is permeable surfaces for the most part, impermeable surfaces for the most part, former warehouses and concrete floor. A new development would be required to retain that water, which would help with some of that. Not all of it, but some of that. And we're also working with DEP to look at sort of what is the need for the future when it comes to stormwater and sewers here. But the second part of the question, sorry, the computer distracted me, was parking and cars. I hear you and the concern. One of the real components of a sustainable Gowanus is actually lowering vehicle miles traveled and the need for people to use cars. You do that by advocating and growing denser and having people live near where they work. And Gowanus it has been, before especially the 1961 zoning came into place, a naturally occurring mixed-use live-work neighborhood. And we want to help reinforce that, and that's also part of helping people not need cars, is because they can get places without it, and Gowanus is really situated well for that.
Please do not shout out. If you want to ask a question, get on the line.
It's all about all that density that's on board. Where are they going to shop? Where are they going to go to? Law school, the place that we can use.
Go to the next question, please. No. We can't have people shouting out. Please, go ahead. Your turn. Your turn. Then you ask.
I have another question.
Good.
Okay. My name is Nina. I'm a resident of Gowanus. I'm a native New Yorker. My interests in this are purely personal and not professional, perhaps, unlike some of the other people who've spoken. So my concerns are affordability and inclusion. We've heard the term affordable. We've heard mandatory inclusionary housing. I want to know how you're defining affordability, if it's like a percent of AMI, if so, what that percent is, and how that's going to play out in terms of prices. I want to know if affordability is going to involve millions of dollars in tax abatement handouts to real estate developers. And I want to know how you're going to prevent displacement and predatory actions by current landlords who might be incentivized to sell warehouse apartments, try and kick people out. In terms of inclusion, I want to know how you're going to ensure that the waterfront is actually accessible and that you're not building a wall of tall condo buildings that feels exclusive and exclusionary, as for me, 365 Bond currently does if you look at the people who are actually using that waterfront. I want to know how you're going to guarantee that every child that plays in Thomas Green Playground is going to feel like they own that space on the waterfront, like they can use it, and that you're not effectively providing a private park for rich people.
Yeah, thank you. No, absolutely. That's also of a key focus for us in terms of not having new open space, which would be over 6 acres in a neighborhood that doesn't have a lot of open space. Make sure that it feels public, and there's one of the reasons why Sagi went through a lot of the baseline waterfront zoning to make sure it does feel public, but also in particular the approach around Thomas Green Park. We did not want to have a situation where the residential park that is fronting around currently, former industrial warehouses, has new developments that land on that park that is just feeling residential and feels privatized. And one of the ways to do that is to make it feel more mixed use, which is more communal, which is more open. And that's why we have requirements and incentivizing a mix of uses in that area. But it's also working backwards, I think, with the waterfront open space of importance to the waterfront access plan to and Sagi can also come up and kick me if I'm wrong on this, but also to making it flexible so that the requirements aren't so onerous, and people can, through the process of certification, come in and build something that reflects also the community. It's active, has markers of what the community is today, historic interpretation, has places for artists to do performative events and whatnot. That's stuff that we want to help promote. And then working, I guess, backwards again to your first question on affordability, there was a lot there. The MIH is something that is still to be, I think, decided, right? It's today, there's many options, but the basic options are 25% or 30%, and they come with different AMIs, and they haven't been selected. Often, we enter a public...
Can you use some numbers for the AMIs?
Sure. I believe 25% is at 80% and 30% is at 60%, or it's the opposite around, sorry.
What is the median income, and what would that percent then be?
Sure, I don't have that off the top of my head in terms of what that means right now, but actually we have HPD here, Lynn, who can talk to it more specifically. Thank you.
Also, it's going to be option one. So just give option one.
Thank you, Paul.
Hi, I'm Lynn from the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, and the AMIs in 2018, let's see, there's a range, so if we could go down to 30% of AMI, a family of three is making about $28,000 a year, and the rent for, let's say, a two-bedroom, 30% AMI is about $575, and if we go up to 60% AMI, and those are sort of common affordable housing sort of ranges, 60% AMI family of three is about $56,000 a year, and their rent at a two-bedroom is slightly, it's about $1,200. And then if you go up to 80%, as Jonathan mentioned, I think that is included in option one. A family of three is about $75,000 salary, and a rent for a two-bedroom is about $18,000 for 80. It is a range, but it is based on what the federal government says is the median income, and we try to provide a range of those AMI percentages. I don't know if that answer.
It does. Thank you. Yeah.
Was there anything else that we missed?
No, just to say that even mixed use, as nice as that is and as important as having storefronts is, if they're large storefronts and if you're effectively creating a wall around a park and a wall around waterway, it's still, that's not making things accessible for people.
Yep, we hear you.
Good evening. My name is Vinny Stellato. I'm a member of 32BJ, and my union represents 460 members who live in this community. We know that economic opportunities are important to this community. We also recognize this rezoning is going to create many new jobs, including building service jobs. What's the plan to make sure there's good jobs that pay good wages and provide opportunities to local residents?
Yeah. No, thank you for that question. And I know actually, I think you or some other group is also coming to CB6 soon.
Yes, we have 32BJ coming to the Economic Development Committee at the next Economic Development Committee meeting to discuss just that.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, my name's Ash. I live in CB6 also.
Hi.
So I think I was really struck by the fact that you in this presentation said, and now that we have this presentation, we'll do an assessment about the impact on schools, potential other issues. I'm wondering how it is that the assessment didn't guide the process here and the development of this plan. It seems like that should have been centered here. So I'm curious to hear about that a little bit. And then I also want to hear about what kind of racial equity assessment you'll be doing in this process or have done, whether you have or haven't. specifically, because we know, and particularly if you've learned any lessons from previous rezonings or our local 4th Avenue rezoning, knowing that gentrification massively and disproportionately benefits white folks and people who are higher earners, and massively and disproportionately harms people of color and lower wage workers. So I'm curious about what you're doing there to make sure that this plan serves the communities that we need to be serving in our community.
Yep. No, thank you. It's also an ongoing conversation we're having citywide, and actually with the help of Councilmember Lander, had a good conversation in the fall around fair housing and actually inclusion, not just in housing, but also diversity through schools in the neighborhood, which we're continuing that conversation, and the particulars are still, I think, evolving in terms of how that can be realized here. But in particular for Gowanus, one of the real opportunities here is that with the development and MIH, there will be an extremely more diverse population through these actions that will help with a more equitable and socioeconomically diverse community. And what was in terms of the proposal, the first question, thank you. Now that we have the zoning districts in the proposal, we can do the analysis, and your question was why can't we do the analysis
why didn't we?
Why didn't we? It's one of the reasons why is because there's a lot of different opinions on what the future should look like, and so we front load that work to say this is how should we actually craft the zoning proposal to get the future in terms of urban design, the mix of uses that people want to see before we actually do the analysis. If we started from the analysis and came to this community, I guarantee you we would be run out of this place because we haven't listened to actually what people want to see in their own community. So we hear that, and also that's why it's early. We haven't, we're still early in this process. We are going to do the analysis and share the results and have that conversation. So.
Thank you. I just want to note that it's concerning to me that on the racial equity analysis in particular, you said, well, we've had those conversations and we're thinking about them and considering them. They should be at the center of what we're thinking about here, and you should be able to articulate very clearly what metrics and measurements we're using to determine whether this is going to have a negative impact on communities of color and lower income communities here. So not just we're having conversations, we're thinking about it, centering it. Thanks.
Hi, Linda Mariano, Gowanus resident since 1974. Hi. Yes, I'm a troublemaker. I will own up to it. I also want to say that I don't feel that this representation that was presented this evening or recently on your website is really honest. I'm afraid that it is something more like a fantasy that politics and developers have constructed for this neighborhood, like something you would cut out and paste on a wall or a window. It's not authentic. I've been part of this planning process for the last several years, and I see many people in this room tonight who also have been there working on this, and I don't see that we've been honestly represented with what we have contributed. And the other question is, for years I have been asking everybody that I have come in contact with at city planning what they know about public place. Everybody from city planning has denied knowing that public place has been designated for public purpose since 1974 and legally. And now suddenly we're faced with a demapping, and I want to know what the protocol for demapping something that has been already designated for public purpose. What is that process? What is the legal process for this? And besides, public place site is a perfect open space for everybody to enjoy, not just people in Gowanus, but Park Slope, Carroll Gardens, Red Hook, anywhere, anybody that walks in New York will walk to an open space this size.
Yeah, we agree with you. It's a great site for open space, and that's why we're mapping parkland
Now,
on
I
it.
want to know the protocol for demapping, as you put it,
Sure.
demapping.
How to demap something is we will put forward a ULURP application to demap it.
In the overall ULURP, or?
Yes. No, as part of this ULURP, we will propose demapping it, the designation as public place, and mapping new streets and parkland on it.
But why would you change the already perfect designation for public purpose? These people are the public. We need open space. Gowanus has one small park which is contaminated.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you. We are proposing parkland here, and it's our intent to
No, not parkland, the entire site. It is almost
Yeah.
6 acres.
The rest of the site, we're hoping to do lots of affordable housing, lots of community space, lots of commercial.
Affordable housing is a myth. We already have affordable housing in Gowanus. These monster buildings that you and politicians and developers want to create is not affordable. And it is unhealthy. Excuse me?
Thank you. She didn't answer the question.
Yeah, what's the answer?
Yeah, so I'm sorry if I wasn't clear. The demapping goes through the ULURP process. We'll put forward an application along with the mapping of the streets and along with mapping of new parkland. It's part of the entire ULURP.
Is that a legal procedure? Once something is designated public purpose, it remains that way. It is not to be changed. And New York state law says no. It is part of the land for public trust. It is also on the waterfront, which belongs to everybody in this room.
No, it's very much legal, and that's why we're proposing it.
Tell me how it's legal. How is it actually going to be changed?
I am not a lawyer, so I'm not going to make that statement.
Well, who is a lawyer then from city planning?
We will be proposing a series of land use actions that we have vetted and to facilitate the redevelopment of the site for affordable housing, community space, commercial space, and map parking.
Let's take it back a bit. No, I didn't make my point. I did not make my point. It is a perfect open space. Why on earth would you, not this community, but city planning and whoever you're involved with, developers, etc., would change it? Why would you take that away from this community? It belongs to this community.
We agree with you, and we want to make this a public benefit that has wider applicability than just parkland. Affordable housing is also a
Don't
public
say
benefit.
just parkland. It is essential.
Absolutely.
Then don't do it. Don't demap it. Don't even try.
Good evening. I did not come to talk about affordable housing tonight, but I did want to, everybody has a copy of the report that's on the city planning website that shows that there's $100 million worth of investment needed in our friends that live just north of the Gowanus Canal. They proposed $4 million. There's $100 million in their own documents right here of investment needed in existing affordable housing today. But that's not why I came tonight. I came tonight to commend the city. They didn't mention in their proposal, they're doing over $1 billion investment to improve the water quality of our Gowanus Canal. Over $1 billion to improve the water quality, such that perhaps when that's done, the canal water quality will be far superior of even Brooklyn Bridge Park, where there's thousands and thousands of people kayaking all summer long. So let's paint that as the future of our waterfront in our community. That said, tonight I heard a mention of mandatory inclusionary housing. And I think that that's a notable cause. But then I also heard incentivize and use incentives and things that are not mandatory. So tonight I'm here, I'm asking, at least in the initial scoping for our city and our elected officials, to encourage the city to say, well, if it is going to be so clean, should we not at least ask for mandatory on-water access? Because we would be able to actually use this freshly cleaned $1 billion investment of our shoreline and mandate that we can safely get on and off this waterway. So that's my question for you. Are you including mandatory on-water access, or is there anything else that's actually mandatory in this rezoning other than what's in your general standard waterfront access plans?
Thank you, Owen. No, our proposal does not include a requirement for, through the WAP, that every site provide in-water access, although we are, and we have heard from you throughout this process that this is a key focus for a lot of the local recreational water users and canoers, and it's a fantastic experience if you haven't gone. The dredgers will take you out, and it's a great way to see another side of the neighborhood, and you really haven't actually seen Gowanus until you've been in the water, frankly. So it's definitely important, but you also are, what we had said in the WAP is we're trying to allow for the flexibility so people can do good things here. Not every single site should have in-water access. We think it should be provided in more places, but we also think different sites can do different things, and we don't want to preclude those other good things, whether it's spaces for artists and spaces for exhibitions and bi-level waterfronts that would impede it. So a broad, blunt requirement is something we don't want to put in here, requirement in the WAP.
Thank you. And the developers in the room, a ladder could be about a few $100s, and if you don't build it, you may just find one on your shoreline anyway. Thank you.
Hi, good evening. Sabine Aronowski. I'm with the Gowanus Neighborhood Coalition for Justice. I work at Fifth Avenue Committee, and I'm also on the board of Friends of Thomas Green Park, and I'm also a member of the EPA Superfund Community Advisory Group. And I do want to just point out to the first part of what Owen was saying when he was talking about the money in regards to public housing, local NYCHA. You guys have a figure of about $115 million that is needed for capital repairs. And we met with NYCHA back in September of 2018, and I believe you guys were there, and they gave us a number of $237 million for the capital needs. So there's a big discrepancy in those numbers, and we definitely want to understand why. And in addition to that $237 million, that doesn't even include all of the different indoor environmental remediation that's needed in terms of mold remediation and lead abatement. So there's a lot of serious indoor environmental conditions that need to be addressed locally. And in that regard, there's a lot of outdoor environmental issues that we have, right? So we've got the Superfund cleanup that is just getting underway. We still have the impacts from Sandy that we're suffering. And in the original framework that was released in June, you guys mentioned the eco-neighborhood, and we were very happy to see that language in there, and very disappointed to not see it carried through in this next iteration. So my question is really in regards to the special district and zoning tools that you guys are using, and how that can really be brought through to help coalesce around this idea of climate justice for our climate and environmental justice in our neighborhood, and how we can really use the investment opportunities that this brings to create some sort of environmental protection overlay district to bring equity, adaptation, and climate action to the forefront that's really needed for our community.
Thanks, Sabine. Yes, I think we've talked about this a lot, and also at the open house.
And the emergency preparedness plan. I forgot about that.
Yes, and I think they got rid of the O, but just EM, emergency management, is definitely part of this process. And one of the things in the framework is, and also the updates, is they're ready to work with us and the community towards coming up with that emergency preparedness this plan. But in terms of the eco neighborhood, I think we had also talked about, and at the open house, one of the things we don't do as a government is is branding in terms of calling something an eco district or not. But it definitely is, and I've tried to stress it, and happy to continue to try to clarify. It's it is foundational to what we're doing to make Gowanus eco neighborhood, more resilient, more sustainable in many regards, and there's many different ways to do it, and there's a lot here already, and I'm sure there are things that aren't here that we're still being pushed on, and that's why it's also not set in stone. We're continuing to refine this, and I think we'd be happy to continue to say and pull out what are the things in this proposal that are part of this sort of move towards sustainability and resiliency, but then what are the things that aren't there that still need to be in there. And we're still, I know, working with you all and others on getting deeper into that.
Yeah, I think we definitely want to see it quantified, the investment in the public realm. For instance, just Thomas Green Park, we know there's a remediation there, and we know that there's only a certain amount of money that's committed to rebuild that park. We want to see the investment that is going to be brought forth through this in the public realm, and then we also need to see the investment in local public housing because there's a crisis happening there. Thank you.
My name is Al Brown, and I want to talk a bit about affordability and inclusion. I notice in the framework you mentioned promote opportunities for new housing with affordable housing. The city, as you mentioned earlier on at the beginning of your presentation, is having a housing crisis. Lots of people are homeless. Lots of people are spending more than 30% of their income on housing. Gowanus typifies that in a very unusual way. My understanding is that the highest percentage of loss of affordable housing is in Gowanus. Secondly, the increase in land values in Gowanus as a result of speculation and whatever investors' input has increased tremendously. We are proposing to have for every four market rate apartments, one affordable unit. That signifies to me gentrification. In other words, the people who can afford it are no longer us here. I read just early on this evening, for 231 units, affordable units, there was an application from 84,000 people. So what I'm saying is that I don't think what we are planning here is really for the people in Gowanus. And my observation is simply that it's business as usual. And I'm not too sure whether those things that have been approved in the past in other areas are providing the city with the need that it has at present, and it is a growing need. And there has to be something done. And what is presented to us, in no way is affordability, no way is inclusion. And I really think that you have to go back to the drawing board if you want to talk about supporting, fostering a thriving neighborhood by reinforcing and encouraging a robust local economy anchored by a mixed use of businesses while creating opportunities for new housing with affordable housing. it really means you're gutting our community. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your statement.
I don't think there was a question.
Yeah.
It was a statement. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi.
Hi, Andrea Parker, Gowanus Canal Conservancy, also Gowanus Neighborhood Coalition for Justice.org. I am, you know what I'm going to ask you about, but first I want to give you some props on the Waterfront Access Plan, because I actually think that, unlike Owen, and we've had this conversation multiple times, I think it really fixes a lot of what's wrong with waterfront zoning right now, and is going to give a lot of mechanisms to build a much more active, resilient, and really open waterfront that's for the larger neighborhood. So I applaud you for that. What I'm not happy about is the sewage, because I also disagree with Owen that the $1 billion that the city is about to invest is enough. That is what the city is already required to invest under the Superfund and the Clean Water Act to address the existing problem. So similarly to Sabine, I would really like you guys to think really carefully about zoning tools that could be used specifically for sewage management in buildings, composting toilets, sewage treatment wetlands, storage tanks. There's a lot of really great technology out there, and thinking about this as a comprehensive water management district is a huge opportunity that I would love to see.
Sure. Thank you, Andrea.
Hi, I'm S.J. Avery. I'm a trustee of the Park Slope City Council and co-chair of 4th on 4th Avenue, and also a member of the coalition. I would like to just sort of quickly respond to the young man who characterized the residents of the 4th Avenue corridor as suburbanites who were resistant to new people moving in, and really remind people here that basically what happened was unbridled development destroyed all of the affordable housing on 4th Avenue. And while I am pleased to see that the city, as it increases the height allowable, only increases it allowing, you know, if the developers agree to do mandatory inclusionary housing. I think it's a great step in the right direction. I think it's too little and too late, and I think the tragedy of 4th Avenue was a lack of will in terms of affordable housing, and also the fact that this planning department can't do anything by design to impact design. They do it in other cities. I mean, 4th Avenue is a design disaster, and it's recognized as that, and it really is depressing to think of more ugly buildings going up. But that's not the main reason I'm here. The main reason I'm here is to share the comments of the Civic Council with the members of the committee. And one of our main concerns was about the fact that and I'm afraid we've gotten into magical thinking here, the actual zoning plan does not specifically mention the almost 25% of the people who live in Gowanus now, people in NYCHA. NYCHA was excluded from that. Now, we sort of talk around NYCHA, and there have been people coming up talking about NYCHA projects, but there's no assurance in the plan of how any benefit of an infusion of new people is going to improve their lives at all. And along that line, it would be really useful to understand how many people is the City Department of Planning expecting to come into Gowanus as a result of this rezoning.
The number of people, that, again, will...
You can give me a range, because I know...
Yeah, I don't have the range right now. We have to do a analysis that will be part of the
So this is,
scoping.
again, we sort of did the planning without the context.
Well, now we know, based on what we've heard over the past couple of years, developing districts that have actual densities attached to it, we can then do an analysis about what would, over the next X amount of years, potentially occur.
So I just want to be clear. This plan was developed, the density of this plan was developed without a consideration of how many people that would actually put in the community.
This plan is evolving. This is early. This plan is evolving. As we said at the very beginning to Steve, it's not set in stone. We're going to have, that's the entire point of the environmental review, is to have that analysis and talk about that publicly, about what does the proposal actually mean in terms of potential new development, and how do we accommodate that.
All right, thank you.
Sure. And if you can also, if you would like to share a copy with us.
I sure will, and
Not just the-
it's in the email for you. But,
Okay.
Okay.
Sure. Thanks, SJ.
Hi, my name's Patrick O'Donnell. I live in Carroll Gardens.
Hi, Pat.
And so I think, we've heard a lot about what people don't like and don't like about this plan. Sorry, is this better? Yes. Okay. So I think one of the problems with people who live in the area is that they feel like what we're getting out of this is not really worth it. And particularly with 22-story, 30-story towers, which will definitely change the complete character of the neighborhood. And I think it would be one thing if it were all affordable housing, but it's not. It's mostly luxury housing. And I understand with the mandatory inclusionary housing, you can't get more than 20 or 30%, but it just seems like a bad deal, that it's not fair to the community, and it's, we have an alternative, which is not to rezone at all. Or we can pass a new law where there's the mandatory inclusionary housing is 50% or whatever. We have alternatives. But with that in mind, I think public place is a different situation because that land is owned by the city, right? And so we don't have to rely on mandatory inclusionary housing. We can do 100% affordable housing. Are you sure about that?
Yeah, we had, I guess you didn't come to the workshop in November.
I asked about this last time, and people were like, yeah, sort of, or whatever. It seems very vague, because it's not in the plan if you look online.
Yeah, I hear you. We're still working with the development team based on now the proposed zoning. The workshop, actually, I don't know if Lynn wants to speak to some of the process, but we're working more to refine what happens on public place, and as we move forward, coming back to the community with more specifics.
Public place is the only publicly owned land within the rezoning area. So we see this at HPD and the city as a huge opportunity to develop as many affordable units as we can. And we are discussing with developer what that means and what that looks like. And if you're familiar with HPD and our projects, we have certain term sheets that set ranges of affordability, and in turn, there is a land disposition agreement on the land and regulatory agreements that set the rents for a pretty long term, usually 30, 60-year terms, so that we make sure that, that land is serving a public purpose for a pretty long period of time. So yes, we are definitely looking at more than 25% affordability on public place, more than 50% affordability, and very, and I think 100% is definitely a goal that we want to hit at public place.
I guess.
I'm sorry, say that again?
Low income.
We are definitely looking at a range, low, very low, middle, moderate is definitely in consideration.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Caroline Todd. I live north of the Gowanus Canal.
Hi.
My question is about how many other rezonings have as high proposed density in storm evacuation zones.
I believe also East Harlem had a portion of their rezoning area also in an area not a canal, but somewhat similar, places where actually development can help with fortifying and making a neighborhood more resilient in the case of climate change, but also storms. So
evacuation zones change?
Say that again?
Do evacuation zones change?
That's a good question. No? Yeah, we'd have to get back to you on that particular question. Thank you.
Hi. I've lived in Gowanus for 25 years, and I was on at many of those meetings in the planning committees and going through this. And what I heard and saw in those planning committees with the participants I was in it with was nothing like this proposal. I don't see hardly anything from what I did in the meetings that I see in this proposal. And I feel like it was business as usual, like that man said, that's going on now, and that all of the meetings were a sham, so you could just say we had a lot of input from the public. And I feel like it's just going to be no control as usual. So what I'm asking is there going to be some kind of way that there can be some oversight while these huge buildings are being made? Because I have lived through at least 12 years of construction, unbelievable construction on my block. The road has been ripped apart 5 times. There's never been any care during storms. There was no sidewalk for 5 years because no one took care of it where they were building. And also, is there any way where there can be some kind of oversight for integrity and design of these hideous buildings that are going up?
On the design, we are trying to craft the zoning to be both flexible and then also in certain instances prescriptive in terms of the bulk as it relates to the streetscape and the width of the streets to promote good urban design principles. But in terms of being extremely prescriptive, that's not something that is in this proposal in terms of requirements down to the smallest details of materials. We're really trying to allow for actually flexibility to promote excellent design, which has been something that Sagi walked through pretty extensively.
And what about what the people who live here, what you do while these buildings take over your entire
Yeah, I'd like to actually have more of a discussion with you on particular issues so I can better understand, what particularly to sort of look towards. And the trucks, is it construction workers? And I think that, warrants us talking more about that.
And thousands of pylons have to be put into the Gowanus because that land is marsh. So we had a few thousand already with Whitestone, now it's going to be tens of thousands. What is that, all of those pylons being used?
Yeah, saying that it's true. Next person, please.
Answer the question.
Yes, there will be pylons. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Brad Vogel, and I live here in the neighborhood. And I'm here tonight on behalf of the Gowanus Landmarking Coalition. And I'm glad we got some people here as well. I'm very glad to have seen in the plan that there's a commitment by the Landmarks Preservation Commission to actually calendar some buildings for designation as landmarks. But I really hope that DCP will continue to push them to not just landmark 3 buildings like happened in several different neighborhoods that were rezoned, but an actual set of buildings that will help people deal with the radical scope of change that we're seeing in this presentation. Because the scope, the scale, this is going to be a lot for a lot of people to handle. Their neighborhood will not look the same. And in line with that, my real question is, we saw a lot about new buildings, and I think everyone's presuming that everything that happens in terms of development during this process is going to be a new building. but Gowanus has a long history of adaptive reuse of the buildings that are already here. And I think we should, especially, we haven't really had a whole lot from, I think the speaker before me maybe mentioned it, but artists and how important artists have been to this neighborhood. They oftentimes are working in adaptively reused buildings. So will DCP commit to holding an informational session about state and federal historic tax credits?
I think that we can talk about that. DCP may not be the agency to best have that expertise, but I hear you on that, and actually it's a good point, and I thank you for bringing it up also as a reflection of some of the input you gave early on the framework as well, that I hope you recognize also in terms of the areas that we're keeping M only and some of the loft buildings that exactly are being or plan to be adaptively reused that are important to a lot of the folks in the community and artists as well. But on that particular, I forgot what you called it already, but we should talk about how to help with that and who would be best to take that.
Yeah, just want to make sure that people are aware that that arrow is in the quiver when it comes to the neighborhood.
No, definitely, and there's actually a couple loft buildings that had applied for some of those in the area already, so.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad everybody's basically done this within the time frame we had. That wasn't easy, I know that. I know some people want to talk more. I apologize if I interrupted you. It's okay. It's okay. I'm going to take a prerogative of asking one question because I know some people thought I was rude. So I have a worry about supermarkets as well, and I'm disappointed that in the citywide program, the Fresh program, that it only applies to certain neighborhoods, but it doesn't account for poor areas within neighborhoods that don't get adequately serviced. And I would hope you consider doing something about that. Now, I don't want you to answer it, but we have that concern, and we have many other concerns, and we share many of your concerns, and we are going to have many more meetings. And when I know when they are, I'll let you know when they are. But we have. CB6 has emails. We have daily updates from our district. We have daily updates from our district manager. You get on the email program. We have a website. You can look at our meeting schedules on the website. We do want your participation. I thank you for coming. I thank City Planning for all their effort. What? Brad is here to listen. He's not here. He's not here to try to determine the process today.
Guys, I was just here to listen tonight. This was your time to talk. I'm glad to sit and listen. So, thank you.
Hey, listen, even CB6 didn't talk tonight, so this was a community session. Thank you for coming. Time to go home because we got to get out of here.